It was a beautiful spring day. The hall at Johns Hopkins was packed, not an empty seat in the house. Well, they awaited their special guest. The President of the United States was expected in just a few minutes. Bill Clinton was coming to exhort the country to allow China into the trading system, to provide China with permanent most favored nation status, and to normalize relations with the country through accession to the WTO. Bill Clinton would say, for the first time, Americans will be able to export product to China without exporting jobs. Americans will be able to export product without having to sell it to the Chinese government. And Americans will be able to sell product to China without transferring technology. For the first time, America will export product. Of course, Bill Clinton ignored some very interesting points, and he was forced to acknowledge them in his speech. He had to acknowledge that China was a communist state, one-party rule, that the government of China would suppress free speech and freedom of religion, and that the government of China would adopt policies that were inimical to the interests of the United States. "25 years later, that decision rings loud, and it will impact inflation, growth, interest rates, investment, government policy, national security, every other aspect of the economy. As we move forward, what comes will be a result of that decision made 25 years ago." Okay. SEC requires me to give you this legal disclaimer and to tell you that everything I say is considered advertising. You can make up your mind, and now that you've read that, the U.S. is running a wartime economy. We have massive budget deficits in peacetime relative to the economy, last seen during World War II. Government debt to GDP is at levels last seen at the peak in World War II. And the Federal Reserve has monetized those, creating inflation. Fed got a little bit concerned about inflation, so it raised interest rates. Did the same thing in the 1930s in the run-up to World War II. It basically got concerned in 1936 that inflation was starting to rise, and it raised rates, and it caused the 1937-38 recession in the Great Depression. It also took money out of the economy, just as the Federal Reserve has done today. However, the exigencies of the situation where the U.S. needed to invest to build the infrastructure and to prepare for World War II forced the Fed to reverse course. This is likely the future today. The U.S., in a way, is preparing for a potential war with China, whether we like it or not. As a result, the exigencies of the situation will overwhelm the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will become a slave to the federal government much as it did in the 1930s and 1940s. This has significant implications for inflation and interest rates and the way the economy will grow going forward. Here's inflation since World War I, more or less. As you can see, the US has had serious bouts of inflation. This inflation comes in waves. So you should think that we have merely had the first wave. There will be more waves as the decade progresses and as the Federal Reserve actually provides the fodder for the federal government to finance itself. At the same time, the Federal Reserve will need to control interest rates because otherwise they will bankrupt the government. Since the US entered the WTO, industrial production has not grown in the United States. It has not grown because China had a massive global market share grab. And so did every other country that was involved in being admitted to the WTO. But China is the poster child as a bad actor. The Chinese government decided that it would grab as much market share as possible until the rest of the world realized what it was doing. And even in the last few years, if you look at its trade surplus, it has gone from $300 billion in 2020 to over $900 billion today. As a result of US industrial production not growing, industrial production to GDP has collapsed. US manufacturing now represents less than 11% of the economy. For most OECD nations, which have actually protected their manufacturing at a much higher level, it represents between 15 and 25% of GDP. And in a place like Germany, it is 29% of GDP. And the reason this is critical is because manufacturing and investment is the key to growth in the economy. If you want to understand why the economy did not grow the way it should have post the 2008 recession, you merely need to understand this. Manufacturing investment collapsed after 2000. And because we did not invest in manufacturing, we did not get investment. And because we did not get investment, we did not get productivity growth. And I'll show you what that means in a minute. And because we did not get productivity growth, we harmed our long-term economic growth, which lowered the rate of growth of final demand, which feeds back into the manufacturing cycle. Here's US private non-residential equipment investment relative to GDP. And as you can see, it collapsed to levels last seen in the 1950s post the massive World War II investment. My dog.
He doesn't
I'm
care.
partial to dogs. And in fact, I can tell you that when he decided that that was his chair, I had to buy a chair for myself. But dogs want one thing. They want to know they're loved. So this is real median income. The scale's a little bit odd, but since 1998, real median family income has grown 8%, or less than 1/3 of 1% a year, according to official government statistics. Now, if we were to adjust CPI to the way it used to be computed, this would be 10% lower. than where it stood in 1998. So for the average family that believes that its income has fallen, it has. And if you notice, from 2016 to 2020, under the Trump administration, you had a big rise until the pandemic. That was because different economic policies were adopted. And if you want to understand what's going on in politics today and why President Biden is so unpopular, just look at the statistics related to consumer spending and unit volumes. Unit volumes have turned negative because consumer prices went up so much, people cannot afford the number of products they used to and have to buy less. It's one of my favorite songs. When I was a kid, my parents had a big old Chevy Impala, and we would hop into there. In fact, the seat was so large in the back, you could lie down and go to sleep. And we go travel on all these wonderful two-lane roads, and we'd run into a stoplight. Stop. And then we get to go, and we'd run into another stoplight. Stop. We get to go a little more, and we'd run into another stoplight. Stop. But then were the highways that were being built out when I was a kid. And instead of doing 35 or 40, all the stoplights, you got to go 55 in a beautiful 6-lane highway. And of course, it cut our travel time by more than 50%. By the way, for those of you mathematically inclined, you can figure out what that means about my dad's driving habits. At that time, the United States spent 6.5% to 7% of GDP investing in roads, bridges, tunnels, rail, and everything else, public health, R&D, etc. And this was in addition to military spending. Since that time, it has been in a constant downtrend. And that is because we enacted numerous social programs that we didn't fund. And then lifespans got extended, so the cost of those programs exceeded anybody's possible thought. Today, we're at an all-time low if we look at the latest data. And that has consequences for everything. If people want to understand why roads are falling apart and have not been in good shape, or bridges need work, or a million other things for those of us who travel and see airports and other things around the world, there's no, this is a simple explanation why the roads in Turkey are in better shape than the roads in the United States. When I was in college, of course, that was for my freshman economics course, right? And for those of us who read the textbook, the professor got up there and we said, big deal. But the professor made an interesting point. He said, of all this gobbledygook, the most important letter is I, investment. And why? It determines the speed at which the economy grows, and it determines the rate at which people's incomes grow in real terms. If you look at what the United States has done, public investment has sort of cratered over the last 30 years. Private investment cratered since 2000. that I created. Well, it's a little hard to tell from this graphic on productivity growth. If you look at productivity during the Obama administration from 2008 to 2016, it was less than 1% per annum. Talk about China's global market share grab, and then we're going to talk about what the US has done and is going to do and where the economy is headed. In 2000, the US economy was 7 times to 8 times the size of the Chinese economy. We produced 3.5 times as much industrial goods. Chinese government understood that industry would drive its future. Today, those are the numbers. The US economy is 1.5 times that of China. And Chinese industrial output is 2 times the size of the United States. So let's talk about how China did this, because I watched this occur. And as a spectator in investing in companies, both public and private, it's clear how this occurred. Back in the early 2000s, I remember China building a series of chemical plants to produce dyes for its clothing. And what did the Chinese government do as soon as those plants were completed? They tariffed all the goods from the rest of the world out, putting tariffs of 30 to 40% on imports. That effectively created massive overcapacity overseas, driving companies out of business and forcing plants to be closed. China repeated that pattern over and over and over again. Its most recent example is semiconductors. The Chinese government has put directly approximately $500 billion into building semiconductor plants over the last few years. They're putting another $100 billion into building its indigenous semiconductor equipment industry. And then what they plan to do, which they've already started to do in some of the components, which are less technologically advanced, is to dump those components on the world market at massive discounts to the rest of the world to drive everyone else's semiconductor plants out of business. China has adopted the policies of Friedrich List. Friedrich List is a famous 19th century economist. And he was the architect of Germany's rise during the 1800s. And one of the most important things that Friedrich List said was that economic might, industrial might, was what gave a country its place in the world. So Germany industrialized massively, just like China. And then it militarized after it industrialized, just like China. That's my grandfather. In 1913, his father established a company called Eastern Metal Spinning Company. They did metal stamping and produced a number of forged products. It was located in the Bronx in New York City, and they were quite successful. They ended up supplying some industry, but they had a very interesting niche where they supplied silver trays and silver bowls and other silver items to the department stores across the country. So they supplied Saks and Nordstrom and Tiffany and all the other major sellers of consumer goods. Along came the Depression, and they ended up working the plant 4 days a week with one shift. Beginning World War II, my grandfather told me he got a call one day, and that call was from a major defense contractor in Connecticut. And they said, "Can you make this part?" And of course he said yes, because he needed something to fill up the plant. And he said, "Can you be here in 3 days with the schematics of how to do it?" And of course he said, "Of course, I'll be there in 3 days." So he spent the next couple of days designing the whole process in the plant and producing samples for the company. They spent the whole Depression and to the end of the Depression into World War II producing that part. Made a lot of money. After World War II, they kept producing their goods and went back to supplying the department stores. Starting in the 60s, they began to face competition from overseas for the exact same products. And the competition got stiffer and stiffer into the 70s. And by that time, they had a decision to make. That decision was build a plant overseas or sell out the plant to the competitor. They decided to sell, and the plant was shuttered. And that production ended up moving overseas. As my grandfather would tell you, he was facing competition with lower labor costs, tax holidays, free electricity, other types of subsidies, and it just wouldn't work anymore. For him, there was no such thing as free trade. For those who believe in free trade, it works to a point, but only to a point. Let's talk about what's gone on in Asia and what the WTO really did. What the WTO did was allow numerous countries into the trading system in a way they hadn't been before. And if you think that China is the only country that provides subsidies, that's just not true. Malaysia just came out with its new industrial policy. They plan to build 3,000 factories of the future over the next 10 years. They want to be the #1 in semiconductor design for EVs, electric batteries, and other products of the future. Indonesia has gone into resource nationalism, where instead of exporting nickel, it actually is going to take the nickel and turn them into batteries. You cannot export non-finished goods anymore. India is offering up to 70% subsidies to build semiconductor plants there. India wants to increase its electronics exports 5 times in the next 3 years. China has now begun to project all its economic might around the world in a way that is designed to enhance its position and undermine the US. For those unfamiliar, today, 26% of the goods that China exports are paid for to them in renminbi. And they plan to take that to 50% and then to 100%. They've set up an alternative system to provide loans to countries, what used to be called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and other alternatives to the SWIFT system. So they are creating a parallel monetary system. For the US, this truly represents a challenge. It was a beautiful day in 1947. An official limo drove up to the curb, and out stepped a tall man with an air of authority. Another man rushed up to greet him as he came to the curb. "Hello, James. Is everything ready?" "Yes, George, it's all ready." "No press, right?" "No press." Of course. That was George Marshall and James Conant. George Marshall had been the chief head of the Army and all the Allied forces, and James Conant had headed the National Resource Defense Council during World War II. That day, George Marshall was at Harvard to give a special speech, a speech about the rebuilding of Europe, a speech that combined with a thesis that was written by a graduate student and given to President Truman by future Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas would become what was known as the Marshall Plan. The US today has effectively entered into a Marshall Plan for itself to rebuild its industrial infrastructure. And it will underpin manufacturing in the country. Start with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, to which we added the Inflation Reduction Act, to which we added the CHIPS Act, private investment, and government incentives. Combined, these represent approximately $1 trillion in investment by the government directly, or 4% of GDP. They incent another $1 to $2 trillion in investment by the private sector, or another 4 to 8% of GDP. Effectively, this is a Marshall Plan for the United States. Marshall Plan, when it was originally originated by Congress, provided less than 4% of the GDP of Europe over a number of years. This plan is 2 to 3 times its size. This is an example of what needs to be built out for EV batteries. Supply chain is actually quite complicated and requires numerous facets. And this is just for one of the precursors that goes into that fire diagram. So just to build out the EV battery supply chain will require hundreds of different plants that employ people to produce all kinds of goods we don't produce today. I call this the modern Marshall. There's one more component that's not explicit, but is implicit. That's to rebuild the industrial defense infrastructure. This is being done in a number of ways. The Pentagon has made clear that it will purchase goods from industry that meet the needs of the future. These include drones, unarmed aerial vehicles, precision missiles, and other types of technology-related goods. The Pentagon has also, through US government, banned the import of things like Russian ammunition. Russian ammunition actually made up 1/3 of the civilian market in the United States. There are approximately 9 billion rounds consumed a year, and Russian imports were 3 billion of them. By banning them, we've now made an opening for domestic US production. Pentagon's done one other thing. It has directly provided R&D for a variety of areas that are needed. Together, it's expected they will issue orders such as to replenish our missiles in a total of $400 billion sometime between 2024 and 2025, which is equivalent to another 1.5% to 2% of GDP. In 2014, father and son stood in grief. Their mother had been diagnosed with cancer, the wife and mother, and she had died in less than a year. And they had decided, what are we going to do to create a family legacy? Father had been a successful entrepreneur, had created a chain of medical surgical centers, and made quite a bit of money. They decided to go into, because the son was a war hero, to go into the arms import and export business. But they decided that was a little too volatile, the orders were too lumpy, and it didn't provide a steady stream of income. So instead, around 2018, they decided they were going to build an ammunition plant to provide bullets. They went to the city of Baltimore. They had found a location. It was grandfathered. They could reduce their stuff there, but the facility wasn't big enough. They needed more space. So they wanted to permit the building next to it. The city of Baltimore said, no, we're not going to have this in our city. So they kept searching. They found an old facility in Hagerstown, Maryland, a facility that produced the A-10 Warthog. Facility had 47-foot ceilings and very heavy floors that could withstand the weight of a bomber. It had steel girders all over, so they knew that if there were any problems in the plant could withstand it. They leased the facility. Then they raised capital from investors to buy the equipment necessary to stand up the plant. That arrived in 2021. 2022, they set up the plant and found that some of the equipment they bought didn't work the way they wanted it to. So they had to rip it apart and rebuild it with certain American-made parts. In 2023, they got that going. 2024, that company will produce over 200 million rounds of completed ammunition. It will sell tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of parts to other manufacturers of ammunition in the United States. And it is on track to ultimately produce at least 500 million rounds of completed ammunition to the market in 2025. Already, 3 NATO members have come to the plant to inquire as to purchasing major parts of their output. That is an American success story. Imagine if the United States replicated this 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times. It would transform the economy. Here's US manufacturing structure investment relative to GDP prior to the modern Marshall Plan. Here is it today. For those who say government incentives don't matter, they do. They tilt the playing field one way or another. And where the US is going is we have tilted the playing field back towards domestic manufacturing. This is another factor. You go back to 2000, the US manufactured approximately 80% of the goods that were consumed in the country. Today, we manufacture less than 50% by value add. There's a huge room to change this, whether in the manufacturing industry, whether it's to manufacture precursors for drugs. There's an interesting study by the government on the components needed to manufacture drugs. Less than 50% of the components needed to manufacture the drugs that are made in the US are made here. They are imported from overseas. Less than 50% of the actual drugs we consume are manufactured in the United States. They are made overseas. There is a large room to close the gap, and the pandemic made clear that there were major holes in the supply chain and national security system. Imagine what that would mean for productivity. Mean higher productivity, higher economic growth, higher inflation, higher interest rates, more tax revenue. We go back to the 80s and 90s, inflation ran between 3 and 5%. The economy grew 3 to 5% per annum, including downturns. And no one complained. Standards of living rose continuously. As we tilt the playing field back here, economic growth will accelerate fundamentally. Productivity growth will accelerate fundamentally. And living standards will rise. And for those who say the US cannot do that, the US is still an R&D powerhouse. The US spends more on R&D than any other country in the world, including China. We just don't make those products here. What if the government, for national security reasons, started requiring those products be manufactured here? It would transform the economy. Oh, WTO. A lot of people say we're a member of the WTO and we have to abide by that. And that means that we can't reshore, we can't do things in our self-interest, and that we're going to allow the rest of the world to continue to take share from the US. Somehow, I don't think so. Let's spend a minute talking about free trade. I want to talk about the origins of free trade and where free trade came from. 1945. The US stands victorious in World War II. Great, we've won the war. We have a problem. We have 15 million troops coming home. They all need a job. We have factories that are half empty because we're not producing for the war anymore. We got a problem. So how do we solve that problem? Well, GI Bill, right? Free college education, subsidized loans to start a business, right? 1 year of paid income tax-free to every soldier, and subsidized mortgages. Oh, Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae, for the first time, provides mortgages to everyone, where they can put 20% down and Fannie Mae will give you a mortgage for 80%. Prior to then, it was very expensive to buy a house, and you needed to come up with a lot of cash. Then let's talk about the third. We have plants here. Europe was flattened. Japan was flattened. There were no plans to produce stuff. But prior to World War II, it was normal that a country would have tariffs to protect its industry from other countries. So what we needed to do was to pry open those countries to enable our goods to go there. Because even with all this demand, we couldn't fill up our factories. So what did we do? We came up with the concept of free trade, which harked back to David Ricardo and his theory of comparative advantage from 1817. And for those of you who have read The Wealth of Nations, which I'm sure everyone in the room has, even Adam Smith did not advocate free trade. And what we came up with the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that was a small club of nations and managed by. And we added more and more nations, and then we wanted to open it up to the rest of the world, and we replaced the GATT with the WTO in 2000. If you think about the period from 1945 to 2000, it was all about opening up the global economy and global markets. You think about the period going forward from, let's say, 2020 to 2040 or 2050, it will all be about protecting your markets and ensuring that things are built in country. And every country in the world is pursuing this. Germany has massive subsidies to move technology production there. They're not talked about, but they're bigger than the CHIPS Act. Europe's enacting system-wide subsidies to locate technology there. I've already talked about India and Malaysia and many of the other countries in Southeast Asia. You have the same thing for countries like Brazil and for many of the countries in Africa. They all want to produce and export to the markets where they can. Anybody have a Samsung phone in the audience? Okay, 25% chance that phone was assembled in Vietnam. 1 in 4 phones for Samsung are put together in Vietnam because the government provided free land and free electricity and subsidized the construction of the plant. China believes it's China's century. China believes that it is on the path to become the dominant country in the world, to dominate from an economic standpoint, a military standpoint, and a financial standpoint, to bring its totalitarian view of the world everywhere. This is the US response. In 1898, Teddy Roosevelt gave his Duties of a Great Nation speech. In that speech, he said the following: to come into conflict with a first-rate power and be unprepared is to invite disaster and humiliation, to create untold suffering for the people. And it is the duty of a great nation to be prepared for such a conflict. In that speech, he had also praised the US for the military buildup of the prior 15 years, which had prevented war with Chile, which had allowed it to triumph in the South Pacific. Today, the US is changing, as it has before. It is adopting what Schumpeter calls creative destruction. Country is moving down a new path, a path that will emphasize an economy that looks more like what was 30 years ago than it looks like today. And as that future comes to the present, it reminds me of a line spoken in 1630 by John Winthrop. 1630, John Winthrop was addressing the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he said at that time, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. All the eyes of the world are upon us." Today, the United States, as leader of the free world, has all the eyes of the world upon us. It has taken steps to preserve that. And that will change how the economy functions over the next decade and the ensuing decade in a permanent way. Well, I think, anytime we look at government statistics, right? What's the old saying? There's lies, damn lies, in government statistics. Right? Okay, so let's talk about this. There are a number of vocational schools. The number of vocational schools is rising. Okay. And what will happen, which is what's happened in the past when the US has needed to train people, is industry gets together and puts these schools up and trains the people. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think eventually you will get government incentives to do this. There are already some, but you're going to get more. I mean, one of my personal projects from a charity standpoint is to create a chain of vocational schools. That's replicable, that can be churned out across the country. I think that that's what's coming. And I see more and more of this. And so that little plan I talked about, they got plenty of people because there's plenty of vocational schools within X miles of where they are. Okay, and I think you're going to get clusters of these schools that are going to deliver the people we need. It's not going to be according to the government. If you waited on the government, nothing would happen, right? Okay, does that answer the question? Correct. Well, we can change immigration policy and bring people in from outside. We've done that in the past, right? We had a policy like, say, Canada. We brought in qualified people and granted them the pathway to citizenship. I think we'd have a huge influx of machinists, engineers, anything we need. Because I know from certain countries, there are people who want to come here and become citizens who are highly educated, have all the skills, and it would be really easy to just increase those people into the US for the short term. I didn't talk about immigration, but that's a whole nother area that needs reform and well beyond the scope of this talk. Well, that's an assumption, number one.
Do you mind just restating the question for our folks online?
His question is, how are we going to have manufacturing without a reliable supply of electricity? Okay. Number one, I don't see an unreliable supply of electricity in the United States. we have plenty of natural sources here to produce electricity. Okay, I am not concerned about that. The bigger issue is labor standards. The bigger issue is environmental standards. The bigger issue is a number of things which you have to adjust for product coming into the country, right? Because if you have a plant in, let's say, India, that doesn't have to meet the same pollution standards as here in the United States, of course, the costs are going to be cheaper, which is why places like Europe are going to a carbon border adjustment tax. They're going to other types of taxes that are going to basically tariff those goods out. And in fact, when China has now tried to dump EVs into Europe, Europe has gone to ban effectively those EVs coming into Europe. Okay. And I think China has significant issues down the line, but we can get into that separately. But I don't see any issue with energy in the United States. We have plenty of domestic sources of energy. We just need the political will to use it. And I think that the exigencies of choosing of whether we're going to have a plant that's going to produce what we need in this country or not will override people who want to ban all kinds of energy.
I just saw Excel 2 days ago is closing one of their 3 coal plants in Minnesota. And
Well,
they intend to close 2 more.
I'm talking natural gas.
Okay, understood.
Okay. Coal has been in decline for 40 years. Okay. So I'm not really concerned about coal. I'm talking more about natural gas. We are one of the major producers in the world and one of the major suppliers of LNG in the world. Okay. And that is cheap and abundant in the United States. It makes us a low-cost producer of electricity on a global basis and makes us a low-cost manufacturer. Okay, next.
What do you feel about the unions, given the past year, how many companies or people or laborers went into the unions? What's that effect going to be? And remember to repeat the question.
The question, well, thank you. The question is, talk about the unions. I think that's kind of overblown. I think it's a very small piece and very big prominent companies, mostly. What I'm talking about for revival manufacturing is going to be thousands of small manufacturers, which is kind of what we need. And the plants today, remember, that plant I discussed, that new plant that's going to produce over 500 million rounds, it employs 20 people per shift to produce 200 million rounds a year. They're highly automated. Labor is going to be a fraction of your costs. So I don't think it's an issue in a modern plant, which is highly robotic, right? There was an article about a UPS warehouse, right? Big article. There are 9 times as many robots as there are people in that warehouse. So I don't think labor is going to be a big impact on the cost of manufacturing.
And where were the robots built?
Robots were built here in the US.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we take a couple of questions from the audience online?
So we don't have any typed question, but I do
Okay.
have someone who has his hand raised here.
Okay.
Joel, can
Well,
you
thank
hear?
very much. That was a very, very interesting talk. I guess my issue is if you look at the past, I mean, the last time people tried to use tariffs to keep out foreign goods, it was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the 1920s, and
That's
that
not-
ought to exacerbate the compression because it did interfere with world trade. Certainly, there's been distortions in free trade. The free trade, as practiced now, was not the classical idea of free trade, where it was, okay, Germany makes great metal and France makes great wine. They will stick to what they know and export to each other rather than duplicating.
So what the question is?
My question,
please.
how do you want to keep China down? Do you think China will allow itself to be kept down? And how will they respond?
Okay, so the question is, how is China going to respond? China has been waging economic war on the United States for 25 years. It's actually the US that's responding for the first time. So I think that's not the question. So I think that's the wrong question. I think the question is China is going to try to redirect all its goods into other third world countries, right? Which is what it's doing. And if you look at the economic data, I think it can do that in the short term. I think the issue is in the intermediate term, in that a country like Malaysia doesn't want to buy its products from China. A country like India doesn't want to buy its products from China. Many of the countries in Africa don't want to buy their products from China. They want them manufactured there by local indigenous companies. So I think that in the short term, they're going to take the exports that they were going to try to send to the United States and to Europe and send them to the third world. But I think ultimately that is not a sustainable strategy. And the problem they have, which is a very big problem, is that prior to this real estate downturn, which has been ongoing for about 18 months, 25% of their economy is real estate and 25% of their economy is related to export-oriented industry. And I don't think that's a sustainable economy. So I think you have an issue. And I think the other issue that's been historically true is that when countries get into trouble economically, they have a tendency to go to war to distract the populace. And that's just a historical fact. It doesn't occur when economies are growing gangbusters. It occurs when they have real economic problems. And I will tell you that any of the economic statistics coming out of China about its GDP growth are not believable, especially in the last few years. They've grown less fundamentally than the United States.
So you and I spoke about this 3 years ago.
Correct.
However, I've seen it in the mainstream in the last couple of months, and that's CBDC. So the Fed said that they wanted to implement it by 2026. And then you see some of the political candidates now say, over my dead body, it's not going to occur. What's the possibility, and what do you think the impact would be if it did occur?
Okay. So I'll just make one general comment on marijuana and CBD and that whole.
Yeah, CBDC,
Okay.
digital currency.
Oh, you mean,
CBDC.
oh, you mean the
Central bank
digital currency?
Yeah.
Okay. I think there will be a digital currency. I think it'll be between banks. I don't think it will be for citizens initially.
So extra okay.
It will be a digital US dollar digital currency that will be backed by the Federal Reserve. They're already experimenting.
Well, no, yeah.
Next question. Okay. That's it. Thank you very much.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.